Hey there, everybody. That was a sharp stop to some cool music, but I'm sure you'll forgive us for that. Thanks very much for being back here at the Philanthropy Mastermind series. My name is Jay Frost, and I'm happy to host this series now since 2016. So if you're here for the first time, welcome. And if this is not the first time around for you, welcome back. Really happy to have you. And of course, to have our guest today, who I'm going to introduce to you in a moment. This is, of course, a CFRE-accredited session today. So if you're collecting those credits, I hope you'll count this among them. You will definitely be able to use what you gain from our guest today in your work. No question about that. I also want to make sure I point to two things that you'll have seen referenced in those slides as we were beginning today. The first of which is that we have, of course, a recording that's being made of this session, so you don't need to ask about that. There will be details on that sent to you after the fact, and also the slides from this presentation, which you'll want to stick around to see because of the comments that our presenter will make as she's introducing that content to you. Those will be made available to you also via email. So do stick around for all of that, but look forward to that content as well and those links in your email. Now, I also want to make sure that you know that all the content from this series is available to you at DonorSearch.net. DonorSearch, of course, is the sponsor of the series, and they've been very generous in providing a platform where we can have people like our guest today talk about really important things in the field of fundraising, philanthropy, and civil society. And you'll find that there are literally hundreds of these sessions over at DonorSearch.net under a number of things in the resources tab, ranging from, of course, these CFRE-accredited sessions to our podcast. And this week, you want to catch that one. That's with Nellie Chaboy, who is the 2022 CNN Hero of the Year. You'll want to catch that really interesting conversation with Nellie. But with that, I want to, of course, welcome our presenter today, who is Lindsey Nadeau. Lindsey, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks, Jay. I'm so grateful that you invited me and glad that we can have a conversation today about leading nonprofits.
Yes, I'm looking forward to the conversation, but first I'm looking forward to learning from you. So what I'll do first is just introduce you for those who don't know you or your work very briefly, and then get out of the way and let you present on this topic. So Lindsey has been, in case you don't know her work, she is serving as the Vice President for Data Insight and Campaigns at UNICEF USA, an organization I'm sure you know and I hope you support. She's also a member of APRA's Board of Directors. If you don't know what APRA is, shame on you. And APRA is something you'll want to look up also after the presentation today. It's at APRA, it's aprahome.org. Yes.
Yep.
Why would I have forgotten that for a moment? And then finally, she's also working as an instructor at Rice University, where I know the students appreciate her, and I'm sure Rice does as well for all the work that she does there. Her experience, of course, dates back all the way back well over a decade, where she was in key roles at Public Citizen, American University, the Center for American Progress, and George Washington University, all great places which benefited from the kinds of content she's going to share with us right now. So I'm going to step back, and Lindsey, take it away.
Thank you for that overly kind introduction, Jay. All right, everyone. I am super excited to talk to you today about how we can set a new standard for building culture at our nonprofits. And it's a topic that I'm very, very passionate about. I love leading teams. I love helping build new connections and investing in people and growing their skill set and maximizing their contributions to the mission-driven organizations that hopefully we all are working at. So today we're going to be talking about, let's see, why are we focusing on culture? We always like to start with the why. We're going to be talking about the origins and the evolution of what I call the standards of collaboration, which is the crux of what we are here to talk about today. How my team has integrated them into our day-to-day work, and the impact that they're having at UNICEF USA. And before I jump into what the standards are, why we created them, and all that good stuff I just talked about, I want to give you a little bit of context about my team at UNICEF USA, because I think it'll help inform like where we're coming from and why we built this. So like Jay said, I work at UNICEF USA, which is a fundraising national committee. We also do public policy and advocacy work and community engagement, but primarily like over half of the staff or so are fundraising focused. So we've got about 160 staff out of 300 that are focused within the philanthropy division. And what we do is we help advance the mission of UNICEF, which our mission is to help them pursue a more equitable world for every child. And within the team that I oversee, we have several different workflows. We have campaign planning, prospect intelligence, relationship management, reporting and analytics, gift processing, and we also do a lot of onboarding for philanthropy staff and technical training. So basically it's like everything within advancement services or development operations is kind of the lane that my team sits in. And when I think about where I started 3.5 years ago at this organization, when I was hired, we had 5 positions. We weren't doing exactly that same list of all the workflows I just mentioned, because the composition of my team has changed significantly in the last 3.5 years. You're going to hear me talk, for instance, in this session about donor communications, which is not actually a team that I lead anymore. As we've grown and we've restructured, we've really thought about consolidating the right teams together. And so I sent donor communications off to be led by someone who is a former president of ADRP, the Association for Donor Relations Professionals. And I am so thrilled that we have that kind of bandwidth at our organization now in leadership. But what we've kind of done as a team is we've added new headcount because leadership was leaning into data and nonprofit and fundraising strategy and data-driven decision-making. So we benefited from that, but we also had some restructures where the gift processing team joined my vertical. So we went from 5 positions to 20 full-time positions, and we have about 6 freelancers and consultants. So it's grown significantly and very quickly in a period of 3 years. And so in the evolution of that, I really feel that the standards of collaboration were our cultural touch point that held us all together. It was the glue. So that's why I wanted to put this session together, to help everyone understand what it can do for a team and an organization. So let's start with the why. Why culture? Hopefully you're familiar with the organization Gallup. They're well known for their polling work, but beyond that, they're also just a management consulting firm, and they do a lot of research. They also offer a product called StrengthsFinder. Highly recommend it. My current shop and last shop really leaned into that. But what Gallup has found in their market research about employee engagement is that 70% of an employee's experience is very dependent on their manager and their relationship with their manager. And that is so critical, the role that we play as nonprofit leaders in making sure that they have a positive experience, that, the way that we interact with them, how empowered we make them feel, how much trust and understanding we build with our staff is so defining about someone's longevity and experience and what they're going to put back into the organization. And beyond that factoid that Gallup found, they have 12 different elements of great management that they have identified. And at the very top is, I know what is expected of me. And right below that, number 2 on the list, they're essentially saying it's that they have the tools and resources to do their work. This is what makes employees feel that they have a great manager. They know it's expected, and I have the tools and resources to do my work. And when you think about that, if you're a leader, that's really abstract and a qualitative assessment of whether we've been clear enough in what's expected and if we've given them the right tools and resources. If on this list there was something like, if I get the highest performance ranking in my annual review, I get a 5%, salary increase. That would be pretty straightforward, and we'd know whether we're meeting that or not. But this is actually a little bit hard to know whether we are really delivering on what employees need to have a meaningful experience. And you'll see from this list, I know it's a little fuzzy, I'm sorry, we will share the slides, that you will see that employees care very much about their work environment, leadership, growth opportunities, teamwork, mission connectedness, individual relationships. Like, those are the themes that really emerge here. And I think that really resonates with me, having worked at 4 or 5 nonprofit shops now. And the conclusion that I drew as I was starting my journey at UNICEF USA is that leadership is not just telling people what to do. It's actually very little of that. It's a lot more listening, I'm sure, as many of us know. But that it's really more about, while a whole team contributes to culture, the leaders are ultimately accountable for it. And if your team has a bad team culture, let's say it's non-existent, it's negative, it's disconnected, it's unclear, it's chaotic, the leader is ultimately the only person who can really address it head on and take meaningful strides toward improving it and building people toward the same cultures, that we're all rowing in the same direction. And I kind of wonder who in this audience has left a job because of a cultural issue. I know I have. I've left for many different reasons. Once it was a direct boss who was unwilling to address some tension between one of my coworkers, a peer, and it really created a toxic environment for a lot of people. Once it was because the head of our division was reining in remote work, and we had gotten used to having 3 or 4 remote days. This was pre-pandemic, and they made the decision to rein it in, and that wasn't a culture that I was about. And then once it was because there was just an overwhelming amount of work and no resources to get it done, and so people were working 60 to 80 hours a week. That wasn't a good work-life balance. And once it was because leadership wouldn't really invest in staff and create growth paths and upward mobility. And those are all very different reasons. But when it comes back to it, they're cultural. It's the culture that the top, the leadership, is setting for teams and staff who are existing in that work environment. So when I think about what it means to work at a nonprofit and what we get out of bed and try to accomplish every day, we don't necessarily always get the compensation that for-profit organizations can provide. We probably don't get like the pensions that public employment can allow as well. But I like to think that if we are trying to change the community, the country, the world, whatever your mission connects to, that one thing that we can offer is to provide a better employee engagement experience and really feel like we are in a supportive, encouraging environment where we try to understand one another, we rely on one another. And I think that that really helped shape how I showed up at UNICEF USA. So let's talk a little bit about how it all started. When I joined UNICEF USA, I was the first team lead hired fully remotely. And this was before the pandemic, like 3 months before the pandemic, I was hired fully remotely. And I knew UNICEF USA was taking a risk, and so was I. There were a couple of people who worked remotely, but I was a team lead who was recruited as a remote person. Others had like come up through the ranks, been there for decades, and they didn't want to lose them and allowed them to go remote. But this was kind of an interesting pivotal moment in UNICEF USA's history. And at the time, my team was based exclusively in New York, and I am in DC. And so that was a little bit challenging for me to think about, like, how am I going to build a connection with these individuals? I can't just swing by a desk, right? I know we've all had probably a lot of webinars about those kinds of remote team dynamics since the pandemic began. But the only tool that we had at UNICEF USA was Skype. And really no one used it. Everything was email or phone calls. Materials weren't shared in advance. Screen sharing was like out of the question. And so from the get-go, I was laser focused on building a healthy team culture, because selfishly, it's one of the few like remote leads, that culture wasn't there for me. So I kind of had to build it. And when I joined UNICEF USA, these are the 3 teams that I was managing. I was hired as the Senior Director of Prospect Development. I had Prospect Research, Development Operations, which was a huge catch-all, and Donor Communications. The staff from these 3 teams, they sat 5 feet away from each other in the office, but they didn't really have a sense of what the others were working on and didn't really collaborate or interact. They didn't know what they could ask of one another, when their work should intersect. They didn't even know at times when it did, and they were being redundant. And they didn't really have the tools to collaborate effectively. I realized that UNICEF USA wasn't just hiring me to manage these workflows, but they really wanted me to build a cohesive team and help them see beyond their own tunnel vision of their own workflows. So the real challenge I faced as a leader was they were 3 different teams, not one team, and they just happened to report to the same person, right? And I was trying to integrate more and more so that they could be conversationally fluent in each other's work, that they could be cross-functional, that they could solve problems together, and that they could reduce the amount of work that they had on each other's plates because they tap into each other's comparative advantages and strengths. And I'm being a little blunt here. The individuals on these teams are top-notch, grade A. They are still on my team. They are terrific individuals. It's just that they had so much on their plates and they didn't have someone to help them kind of level up how to interact with one another and how to rely on each other and work as a team. And so that's really what I was trying to solve for. So what I wanted to accomplish was to bring these teams together like this, where all three work streams needed to understand where they overlapped. And at that overlap, that intersection, that's where culture's built. They would learn how to collaborate, how to best communicate, and what problems they could solve together by tapping into each other's knowledge. So I thought back to where I had experienced that culture the best that led to this kind of a team dynamic. And it was when I worked at the George Washington University, leading a portion of what was then the hybrid research and relationship management team. And one of the things that made it great was that we had these rules posted in our queue. There were our original John's management rules. I'm referring to John Thorson. I was lucky enough to work for John Thorson at George Washington University. He's a past president of APRA, and he's an AASP co-founder. And as part of the onboarding, if you were a supervisor at George Washington University in the advancement services stream, you got to sit down with John and talk about his management roles. And he didn't necessarily phrase it this way, but they were his expectations of how we operated. And I think even if you weren't a supervisor, everyone was aware of these and operated by them, but managers were held accountable to them. So it was really a cultural touch point for us, where we could be accountability buddies for one another as we were working. You know, if the reporting team and research needed to work on something together, we could say, hey, let's start with yes here, which means don't start with all the reasons we can't do this, but like, how do we get to yes? Or if someone's complaining about a colleague, we remind them, let's assume good intent. We don't know what's on their plate. So we would come back to these, and in coaching conversations with my supervisor, Aunt Dean, who's also an amazing rock star from GW, or with John, they would say, let's not do the idle complaining. You did your idle complaint. Let's now turn this into something productive. And those were helpful reference points for me to go back to, that it was something that was at the core of our identity as an organization on John's team and how we wanted to work. So my first few months at UNICEF USA, I realized that this might be the key for what my team needed to help bring that integrated vision and understanding. So what I did was I set out to clarify expectations, build a common language, and provide that cultural touch point that was missing for my new team. And so the work began. I started with John's management role. I vividly remember being in a cab because I had gone to New York to meet with my team in person and try to pitch them on this idea. Let's like write some guidelines down. Let's clarify what we need. I vividly remember being in a taxi, furiously writing and adapting John's rules. And John Thorson is a man of few words when he writes. He loves Strunk and White, the style guide. I prefer to be more verbose. It is a choice. But I think my team also really wanted the added context, and they actually pushed me to add additional sections when I had shared my much expanded draft with them. And one decision that I made when I built them was, you know, John's rules were technically the management rules, and he really marketed them to the supervisors. When I sat down, because of where my team was at, I started with, what are the expectations of everyone on this team? And then I also built in a section that were just for the supervisors. And I did that on purpose because I think it is essential for individual contributor level staff to understand what their supervisors should be held accountable to, and that they are empowered to do that, or they are empowered to try another route to have that happen. So for me, I think you need both. What I did then was I reviewed it with my direct reports first, got their input. They helped me expand it even more. And then I shared it with the whole team. More input came. And we had our first draft of our standards of collaboration. Now I'm going to pop a link into the chat because it's like a 3-page document these days. It's not super easy to share in a PowerPoint. But if you want to dig into what it is I'm talking about, there's a link on an APRA article that I'd written. And it's the third link on the page called Download a Copy of the Rules Here. Go in there, you will see all like 3 pages in its full glory. But I just want to bring us back to like the reason why we built this out in our first draft was because I wanted it to be written down because my team likes that. I wanted to be able to use it in lots of different ways, and having it in writing would do that. And I felt like I needed it in writing so that folks could provide their track changes, their comments. We could have group discussions about it, because I don't like to dictate culture, and I don't think that that works. We all build culture collectively. Now, there are some non-negotiables, right? Like show up on time or communicate if you can. Like those kinds of things you can dictate. But in terms of all of the other aspects of how do we as an or how do we as a team want to agree to collaborate, or what can we expect from one another, or what do we need to be mindful when we're engaging with others? Those are things that you want to build consensus around. Okay, so our first draft, this is a summary of like the headlines of our top line standards of collaboration for our team, for every team member. Some of them, I'm not going to go through all of them because there's lots. And once you get the slides, the link is also here on this slide for you to be able to click into the document that we shared in the chat. Thanks. So some of my favorites. Number 2, ask for what you want, settle for what you need. I have team members sometimes who are so timid, and they come to me and they're like, do you think maybe I could possibly, like, would you consider, could I leave an hour early? And I'm like, oh my God, love you. I don't have time. Like, just yes, adult, tell me what you need. And if we had a conflict, if it's like we have a meeting with our C-suite leader, then maybe we'll need to figure out how we work around that. But just in general, personally, professionally, that is a mantra that everyone on my team knows exactly what I mean when I say it to them, and I have heard them say it to one another at times too. And so I think that's really some of the great power of this kind of a team social contract, is another way that I think about it, where people can help spot for one another. Hey, no heroic measures. Like I literally just had a team member say he's going to go through over 100 gift adjustments this weekend because the backlog is so long. And I was like, nope, no, you're not. We're going to get the whole team to pile on that. We're going to fix that problem. That is not worth your whole weekend. And then another one that I love from this list, number 6, John's framework in the original management rules was no idle complaints, right? And what I did was kind of pivot it into a framework that one of my former professional learning and leadership development colleagues when I was at GW used to say, which was vent or solve. Like, what kind of a friend do you need me to be right now, or coworker or colleague? Do you just want to vent? And I'm going to give you like 2 minutes to do that. Or have we had this conversation multiple times, and do we now need to turn it into a solve, right? So we turn it into a productive conversation at a certain point. And I literally used that one today with a team member. I had open office hours and someone dropped in, and they were going on about a certain situation. And I had had a couple conversations with others about this particular challenge before. And I was like, okay, I'm here to hear you. I will be your sounding board, but let's get that vent out of the way. And then we're gonna collectively brainstorm right now. I've got 2 ideas. What do you have? Does that sound good? And we turn it into the productive solve. And so it takes any like friction or tension away from being like, don't whine at me, which perhaps if your leadership style is that, you could pull that off. That's not really how I roll. So I just bring them back to that reference point that we've drilled into everyone's head. Okay, it's totally fine to vent. I'm a safe space. Vent at me. Now we're going to pivot. I also love number 8, make new mistakes, because I push my team every single day to be iterative, to innovate, etc. And we are going to make mistakes. We are going to fail, and we have to celebrate those failures. And it seems weird to celebrate. It's kind of like cliche to say that, but we often do make mistakes. And really the one thing that we look out for is repeat mistakes. When there are repeat mistakes, and that means we are not learning and not growing. But I feel like a lot of people, especially new managers at times, are very scared of their staff making a mistake, and they will micromanage. And so allowing them to feel empowered that it's okay for not only them, but their staff to make new mistakes because they're trying something big and bold is totally fine and encouraged. And finally, my favorite thing, and it seems so tiny to have on this list, but and when do you need that by is one of the most powerful things to manage influx of requests and to really help you prioritize. And it's something that I have to remind my team to do constantly. So when they're sending things to me, I often have to say to them, okay, you're asking me to look at this. When do you need that by? Like, you have got to manage up to me. And I don't use that as a bad term. You've got to manage up to me so that I can better prioritize and get you what you need. And sometimes people forget about rule number 2, when they are doing that. And they'll be like, I don't know, when do you think you can do this? I'm like, no, ask for what you want and settle for what you need. Give me a deadline. And if I say, oh, I can't, because I've got these other big things, then you'll settle for what you need. So some of these are mutually reinforcing. Okay, here's the section of our standards of collaboration that focus on supervisors, because like I said, I did maintain that like management focus on here. And the first one on here actually came from that same professional learning and leadership development colleague that I worked with at a management training that she helped organize. She led her favorite, or she shared her favorite professional advice, which was unexpressed expectations equal premeditated frustrations. So as a supervisor, when I'm frustrated with my team member or the deliverable doesn't hit the mark or falls short, delivered late, etc., I start first with reflection on, could I have been clearer? Was I clear or could I have been clearer? I go back to look at what did I send them in writing that maybe led to this outcome where I wasn't specific about something. I also really love the second one, which is focus on what you can uniquely do, which is something a different leader at GW that I haven't mentioned said to me. And I think it really helped me level up my management focus. And I try to think now about if someone on my team can do something 70% as well as I could, I delegate that because it's not worth my time. And with different team members, you might have different percentage that you want to keep in mind, right? But I think that these rules help a manager understand how to get more done, really. That's what we're talking about, is like, how do you delegate? When do you delegate? How do you provide feedback, which then allows your staff to be more empowered and have, course correct and develop faster? And then another area that I spend a significant amount of time on, and sometimes it's really painful because we don't have the time as leaders, is to be transparent in my decision-making. So trying to lead with the why at times and having lots of discussion about some of the decisions, if they are rocking the boat or there's lack of clarity or there's panic, et cetera, you want to try and avoid that by being proactive with leading with some of your transparency. So a lot of these are probably very intuitive, so I don't want to belabor them too long. But let's talk about, what do we do with this document we have? It also includes, and I know you're not looking at it right now probably, but it also includes a section on how we want to communicate, like what are the appropriate channels for email, our Slack messages, phone calls, meetings, etc. And it also includes response time expectations and how we prepare for paid time off, and how we set ourselves up for how we create a coverage plan across our team, because that's a huge collaborative effort as well. And then how we re-enter and set ourselves up for success. So for instance, we carve out, if we're out for 5 days, we carve out 5 hours. Our first day back, no meetings. You might have a quick check-in call with your supervisor, but your only goal is to catch up, because re-entry is so hard. It's so hard, and nonprofits in particular don't care that you are on leave, and your email will pile up and your Slack messages will pile up. And so we've thought as a team about, like, what do we need to make sure that no one is ever in a position that they're going to say, it's just easier if I don't take my 2 or 3 days off. I'm just going to work because there's just so much to do. Because that's where we fail as a nonprofit and as a leader, right? Okay, so check out the full document. But how are we using these every day in our work? Lots of ways. First off, I just want to highlight that this is a living document. It's 3 pages, partly because it's grown over time. I think it started as 2 pages and we've just kept adding. One of the things that we did was we built in the communications guidelines, because that's something that our team wanted. They wanted to know, like, how fast do I have to respond to a Slack message versus an email, and what do we use them both for? We also built in that PTO policy that I just described. And so we've probably released like 4 or 5 of these iterations of this document since we started it in 2020. And one of the things that we want to make an update for, is including our organization's philosophy around DE&I, which we actually call diversity, racial equity, and belonging, so DREB. But we want to put an intentional aspect of that in our work and how we want to engage with that work as humans who work at UNICEF USA. And so we already have a planned update around that. So very much a living document that will evolve over time. So we're constantly looking back at it and saying, like, does this reflect the culture that we have right now? But we also involve it in some of our day-to-day operations work. So if we are hiring and recruiting, which we are, check out our job posting, we are sharing with our finalists this document because we want them to get a glimpse of here's what's going to be expected of you if you are a member of this team, if you join. And I've gotten really positive feedback from some of the candidates that like it's a very clear, emotionally intelligent document that helps them understand that they are walking into a team that has a lot of intention and how they operate and relate with one another. So highly recommend if you ever create something like this, show it to your candidates. If they balk at it, probably not a great indicator that they will be a good fit culturally for your team. If they have a great idea about what to add to it, or they have clarifying questions, probably a good indicator, right? Okay, we also integrate it into our feedback. So we have weekly check-ins with our supervisors, and meaning the individual contributor, or rather the direct report and the supervisor have weekly check-ins, and we integrate it into that. So if I'm giving feedback to someone and I didn't have a chance to address it in the moment, because I love to do that a little bit more if possible, but on our agenda, we have a section that's like 360 feedback. I go first as the supervisor and I'll say, team member, I love that you delivered that on time. I was a little nervous that perhaps it was something that I could uniquely do, but you really showed that you have gotten the ability to do this like 80-90% because I had very light edits on it. So congratulations, I love it. I'm going to delegate that stuff to you more. Or you could say, I noticed that you're working more and more after hours, on the weekends, and I want to remind you of our no heroic measures. And I'm here to support you in making sure that you have clear priorities, and that if you need more resources or fewer priorities, things moved off your plate, I don't want you working 60, 70 hours. How do I help you not have to be a hero in that way and carry so much for the team? So we have that built in, and we also have a feedback source portion for the individual contributor or direct report to provide feedback to their manager. It's like clearly outlined in the agenda. It's two-way feedback, and we ask staff to focus on the standards of collaboration and integrate references to them when their feedback is applicable. We also include it in our retreat. So a retreat we had about a year ago or so, we did the inventory of like, does this still reflect our culture? What should we update? What is missing? What is out of date? And I think it's important as a refresher. We've also had it be a prior retreat. Before that, we had a session on which we had people fill out a survey. Which of the standards of collaboration do you feel like you understand the least? Which are the least clear to you? And based off those results, we had discussion groups like, what does this one mean? How do you apply it? How could we more clearly word it? And so we've really honed the wording to make sense to at least to our team over time. So there's a lot of different things you can do with this kind of a document that refreshes it in people's mind. We also have integrated the standards of collaboration and calling out things that we see when we do retrospectives for something that we call Agile Sprint. I'm sorry if that's a very obscure topic. Basically, it's our project management philosophy, and we structure our project management work into 2-week cycles called sprints. And at the end of it, we do a retrospective analysis of how did that go? Did we meet all of our goals? And if we didn't, are there like elements of the standards of collaboration that we can pull into our observations and our cross-team conversations? And then finally, this last one really just builds on the feedback, because hopefully all of the feedback that you're being provided or you're providing to your staff throughout the year then gets reflected in your annual review. And so as a team lead, I review everyone's reviews. It takes a while. And I make sure that there are at least 2 to 3 standards of collaboration that are either pointed out as things that they do really well, that they embody in their day-to-day work, or that they need to work on, that are challenges for them, and that there are specific strategies about how we work toward better embodying them. So let's talk a little bit about impact and scale at UNICEF USA. So I mentioned we have a professional learning and leadership development team at UNICEF USA. I love this team because I am very growth oriented. And they have actually developed a workshop based off us being the initial folks to launch this. So they will partner with any team at our organization now to help that team build their own version for their team. And so we actually I have 4 that I know of. I think there might be 1 or 2 more, but there are 4 different teams that I know of at UNICEF USA who saw what our team did and have adapted their own. And it's actually really interesting to look across the other teams because there are some really interesting things that they have purposefully tailored to their team, but there's a lot that remains the same, that there's a very core culture, I feel, at UNICEF USA where what our team put forth resonated. And I think that's very affirming about wanting to work in an organization where we all value very similar constructs about partnership, collaboration, communication. But just to see it kind of take off inside has been amazing. But I think when you think about it more about like the team level, the individual team member, really it creates the social contract that I mentioned. It gives them something in a safe space to say, hey, I'm observing that this standard isn't being met, or hey, I'm struggling to meet this standard, right? And I feel like when you give people a framework to draw on, it makes it so much easier to have conversations that could be very challenging otherwise. And it creates those clear expectations. Talked about the safe space. And it has in probably 2 or 3 hiring situations, like made that candidate really want to lock in and like be patient for us to get the offer to them because they were so excited about joining our team because of the culture that we had created. And yeah, it really provides us the opportunity to explore our team's culture and know that we can do that intentionally with one another and that we're committed to it. So I just want to bring us back to this slide, which we started with. And when I was talking to that amazing professional learning and leadership development team about like, what do you think the impact of this resource has been on our organization? They said very succinctly, standards of collaboration help us know what to expect and what is expected. And I feel like that really met that Gallup need. The number 1 element of a good manager is to help create understanding about what is expected. And so for me, I feel like we hit the nail on the head and accomplished what we set out to do, but it took probably 2 years, I feel, for us to get it to a really good place where we haven't made a heck of a lot of changes to it in the last year. And I don't think it's because we've forgotten about it, but it's just because we've gotten it to the point where we've covered the ground we needed to, with one note that we need to also reflect our intentionality around diversity, equity, inclusion work. But this was the sign that I felt like not only had it scaled, it had the impact that we set out to have. So that's all that's involved with today's session. I can pull the slides down and you'll have my contact information when the slides are sent out.
Thank you so much, Lindsey. That was awesome. And people were listening, so they weren't writing. This is a perfect time if you've held back to go ahead and enter any questions in the Q&A. And if there are any in the chat that you placed in there, please go ahead and put them over in the Q&A as well, just so we won't miss them. And as we dive into that, I just wanted to ask you a quick question so that it gives people a chance to put anything in the Q&A they might have. And that is, you mentioned something towards the end, a couple of things that were really fascinating. One, which was that some of this also set the stage for people who are coming in as employees. That's pretty remarkable because you may have done 2 years work, but there are a lot of people who might turn away from an organization because they don't know the process internally. They may not even know, therefore, there is a process. Communicating that you have all this in place where you really give employees dignity and they understand the terms of their engagement and they know what they can do and they won't be overburdened. They won't be subject to this heroism thing is really meaningful. What has it meant for recruiting more people into your office after having established this process?
I think their onboarding has been faster, more smooth, because they're not like trying to find the right person to be like, how quickly do I have to respond to email? So they have a document that like lays it out for them, or, how bold can I be in what to ask for? Or is it hard to get time off here? And we're like, no, please take it. We have unlimited PTO. It's one of the perks. Please, 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 please go take it. And this is how you do it. And you do it well and successfully. They have a model to point to. Mm-hmm. I also think that it's like, I did post it on LinkedIn and wrote an APRA article. And so I think some awareness is being raised throughout our industry of like how you can just, it doesn't take a lot. It's not a resource intensive process, right? And so I wonder how many more candidates will be like, what can you tell me about your team's culture? Like, that would be the dream. That's how I know that we really have had, an impact on the industry. If people are starting to ask questions and like expect something tangibly written down and documented to help guide and develop team culture, that would be amazing. But, the part about recruitment, I actually that wasn't my idea. I have to give credit. The foundation partnerships team at UNICEF USA had asked me to come talk to them at their team meeting. They're like, what is this standards of collaboration you're talking about? And then I've heard your team developed. And someone just asked me the question from that team, do you ever show recruits this? And I was like, oh my God, that's an amazing idea. No, I haven't. We're going to start doing that. And we've done it every time since. And usually the candidate that we're going after is more than happy to jump on board once they see that document.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, that was the other question I was going to ask, but I think you kind of answered it, which is once you establish something like this, does it then populate itself throughout the organization? Because this is about your team. And it sounds like this process works really well end to end from coming into the organization, even maybe as people decide that they want to do something else at some point in their life. All of that's very clear, and clarity helps. Has it also been something that then kind of propagates itself throughout an organism like UNICEF? Because it's a big place.
Yeah, it is. And when I shared it with my boss at the time, she recommended that I share it with that professional learning and leadership development team, which I did. And the vice president of that team is amazing and has strong connections with all of the teams and is very plugged into the training needs and culture, even if we weren't necessarily calling it that 100%. And so she started showing other teams it, and she asked my permission. I was like, yeah, of course, that's fine. And it was just amazing to kind of see it take off. And I was talking to someone internally today who wants to move to my team. I was like, let me show you our standards of collaboration. And he was like, oh no, my team already has one. Yeah, we spun our own version off. And I was like, oh, I didn't even know about your team. So it definitely is taking on a life of its own, which is terrific to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And now we do have some questions. If anybody else has one, go ahead. We have a few minutes to tackle these. So I'll just take them in sequence, if that's okay, Lindsey. And the first one is, how do you recommend having a conversation, if at all, with your new supervisor after having left behind a toxic culture at a prior employer?
Okay. If I were you, because obviously I was on the flip side of this, and so I didn't have to like go through someone to get buy-in. But if I were you, hopefully you have a manager who will be open to someone bringing this to the table and offering to do all of the work, right? Needing the official executive sponsorship. But as a leader, for me, if someone else wants to start a new initiative that's going to help benefit the whole team, I would recommend that you volunteer to do the whole work, or at least recruit like one or two other people to help you if you need that kind of blended perspective, if you've got like kind of a large number of teams reporting into your supervisor. So that's what I would recommend doing. That goes a long way. Now, if you feel like you're going to encounter resistance because they think culture is great, like the existing culture is great and you don't need to shore anything up, then you could always turn to like, maybe you're not trying to do a cultural revolution, but documentation. There's value in documentation. And like, won't it make it easier to clarify things in the future and onboard people? You can talk about the recruitment angle and all of that. I feel like there's value just to putting it on paper, even if you're not saying like, I'm going to revolutionize and improve our culture, because that can be somewhat off-putting if the leader thinks the culture is fine. So just like kind of sneak attack them with it a little bit in an indirect way of like, no, I'm just going to do this thing where I start writing it down. We're going to get some feedback on like whether I've accurately captured our current culture. And then you can go from there with like, well, now here's one suggested improvement, right? And I think there's strength in consensus building as well as you go on that journey.
In 500 programs, I've never heard anybody use the term sneak attack. But it's obviously it works. We have another question here. How do you recommend making a fresh start on your own after departing a toxic culture for a healthier culture?
Oh, well, okay. I didn't have, obviously I said I loved my culture at GW, all the other cultures that I came from. And I kind of had to take the management rules and really wrap my head around like, what am I supposed to do with these, right? So I had to kind of clear my space, my headspace of past shops where there were a lot of different cultural issues. Many of them, I read you guys the list of why I left. And in particular, the one where it was toxic between my peers and our boss would not help at all build the consensus or way that we should collaborate or provide clear behavioral expectations in that case. I really just needed to take stock of what I wanted, what I needed out of my team in order for me to do the best work, and like build the ideal state and try not to compromise too much, maybe tweak it a little bit. This is if you're a leader, right? And you're setting the stage of expectations. If you're managing up a little bit to improve culture, that's a little bit harder. But for me, I just started with what would an ideal state look like? And then I did tweak a few of them to bring it down to reality for some of my team members when they expressed concern about like responding to my Slack messages in a certain amount of time that I had first named. It's like, okay, fine. Or like at one point I had said that there was like absolutely no situation in which my team should be working on the weekend. Weekends are off limits, no fundraising emergencies. And I got feedback in a group discussion with my direct reports that me holding someone accountable to that, because I did, was actually somewhat hypocritical because I flex my hours during the week to an absurd degree. I have like hobbies and interests that I want to do that conflict with work hours. And so sometimes I start at like 6 a.m., which to them is equally as absurd, right? And so you've got to like set that ideal state, clear your mind, let go of the garbage, like name the toxic stuff that influence you to want to build these things. Start with a fresh perspective of what the ideal state would be. And then you have to be prepared to compromise a little bit because work and life is negotiation, right?
Yeah, it's as you say that, it strikes me that every time that we try to be open to new things and implement a policy like the one you've described, one of the potential risks, I guess, is that we are overlaying that with our own sense about what is the best thing for all people. Well, 6 a.m. is not when everybody wants to be up and working. And so, and the weekends aren't sacrosanct for everybody. So being open to that discussion changes the parameters. Another question was, any thoughts about smaller teams versus bigger teams? And this person says, our organization is only a handful of staff. Seems like a lot would still relate to a ton of the resources and time, but curious if you have any other thoughts on that. This comes up a lot throughout the whole series about, in fact, I'll bet there are some people wondering right now, okay, well, you had all these people and you had all this time and you had a leader like you, time to write a policy, time over 2 years to test that policy. And some people in small shops might be thinking, well, how in the world can I do that? I'm doing 15 jobs. But can you talk about that a bit, about the practical dimensions of implementation like this?
I would say start small. And I think that's always my advice. Even like we're doing pretty advanced data analytics work where we're at, but we're starting small. And every time someone's like, I want you to do AI, I'm like, whoa, no, okay. We're going to start with the walk, crawl, walk, run, right? And so what I would do in that situation is probably work across the entire organization if it is in fact that small. Mm-hmm. And I would identify the area of most need. So let's just say it's communication norms, because frankly, that's kind of straightforward. And it's like, okay, if I get an email, do I have 48 hours to respond, 24 hours to respond? Or maybe you think about it in terms of business hours, right? Or like one of the things our organization is actually trying to work through is what is the right mode, Slack versus email. And we are, as an organization, we're really still struggling with it. And we stood Slack up a while ago. And I feel the push and pull between, some folks that I wouldn't even expect that from. And so having those conversations, which we're having internal communications working group to help us agree as an organization, which actually can be more difficult with 300 people and driving adoption, right? Versus a smaller organization of just a handful of staff. So I would just start with something super simple like that and get folks used to the idea of writing it down and building consensus. And then maybe teeing up, what are the next 1 to 2 things that you want? Like, how do you want to negotiate with your colleagues? Or how do you guys want to work together as a team? Do you want accountability through feedback? Maybe start writing that down. Like, that was the number one thing on my standards of collaboration for all team members was you will get and give feedback every week. And if you are not, you can come get me. And I say that to people all the time. And I went and saw a team member last week, and they mentioned to me, like, I get you're doing a great job. That's the feedback they're getting. So I'm like, okay, I'm now going to go talk to your supervisor, and I'm not going to like rat the person out, right? But I'm going to make sure I'll be like, hey, what are some examples of feedback you've been giving to your team member recently, right? And that'll help. That's going to help apply a little bit of pressure top down to make sure that that individual is getting what they need. And so that's an interesting place to start, because I think a lot of like HR departments will want that regular cadence of feedback to happen. And so if you can kind of think about policies that are already in place, we're starting to write down the qualitative elements. Like, what does that really mean to do that work? Whether it's how you structure your one-on-ones, or the expectation that you get a supervisor check-in every week, or that you get feedback in that. Like, those are some other somewhat simple areas, if you guys already have a policy, to talk about how you do that work and how you want it to take shape.
You were talking really about a lot about communications in there. And right before we began today, before anybody was here with us, we were talking about receiving phone calls and kind of the shock for some people at receiving a phone call at all. And it strikes me as you talked about this, including right now with this kind of feedback loop that you developed that helps to reinforce this process and make sure everybody's engaged and being successful and feeling good, that part of this is also probably trying to make sure you're managing the way people communicate. So you just talked about Slack versus email. And I'm not going to make a generalization about generations, but we hear a lot about that, right? About some people liking email, other people hating it. Some people loving text, other people loathing it. How are you negotiating that? And I don't mean just about which platform like Slack or not Slack, but as you have people, different generations, different backgrounds, different everything, when you need that feedback, how are you doing it in a way that people don't feel like they're making me do something in a way that's uncomfortable for me to have that feedback?
Yeah, I mean, so you're not talking about the Slack versus email. You're talking about how we provide feedback about whether you're.
Yeah, because you probably have one person in the office is more, I'm using in inappropriate terms, but like, for example, that they're more introverted or extroverted or ambiverts or whatever, pick your terminology, but some people will want to communicate verbally. Other people want to communicate in writing. Some people want to use Slack. So how do you negotiate some of that to implement this process?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I actually am, I think, like one of two extroverts on a team of 20. Like it's pretty rare in my lane that you find a significant number of extroverts. You find a lot more of those on the front line at times, although some of the best gift officers I've ever worked with are actually introverts. And I think when we have a smaller team, it was a little bit easier to align around that. And as we've gotten larger, and especially as our gift processing team has come in, which is like a whole new cultural revolution for us, it's been a little bit challenging to maintain our standards. We're going to have to adapt them a little bit to accommodate the other culture, or to integrate them effectively into our culture, rather, because there definitely is more of a pull to use email at times through some of the team members, but others, they're on Slack more than I am. Like, I wish I could keep up. So there really is just variation across the team. And there's going to be conflict, especially the larger the group, or like the less homogenous the group becomes, right? And that could be because of their own bias towards systems that they're used to. It could be because they get a lot of external email and therefore they're always in their email. Like, I get a lot of stuff from APRA that can't be in Slack, right? So I have to be in my inbox, whereas someone who has mostly an internally focused job will be in Slack more, perhaps, because they can communicate with everyone they need. And so I think it's trying to understand the motives for what's driving that behavior. Is it a resistance to technology? Can I upskill that person so that they better understand how to navigate Slack? And at a certain level, that's obviously my technology team's responsibility. But I try to understand the motive behind any pushback or struggles to see if we can address it so that we can continue to operate at the level of culture that we want, which is primarily more Slack driven. That is my mandate to my team. I have provided feedback to them at times when they were sharing things via email, like when we had new prospects identified. The gift officers are more in email because they have external facing jobs, right? And so I was like, no, we're not actually going to cater to that, because the organization has made the choice to use Slack as our primary communication tool, and this is an internal communication. Therefore, I'm asking you to put it in Slack, and if someone gripes to you, let me know, and I will be the bad guy that comes up and says, I'm sorry, but our organization's communication platform from internal communications is Slack. And this way, other staff will have the option to go back in history and it will be buried in your inbox as you were that staff member at the time that received that. But in the future, when you're added to a channel, like there's so many pros and cons to using both platforms, right? For what you're trying to do, and what we're trying to do is an internal thing, and therefore this is the right tool. So I try to be understanding, but as a leader, you kind of have to see the bigger picture of what are you trying to accomplish with this form of communication at the moment, and then make the right business decision, and then be transparent in why you're making that. And it made some of my team members uncomfortable. They would rather do email because that is what their gift officers want. Like, well, it's a bigger picture, and I can see some of the politics of our internal organization trying to figure out the Slack versus email thing. And I want to drive adoption of Slack because that's where our organization is going. So hopefully that's like a semi-illustrative example of how I've navigated that. Sometimes I'm much more accommodating, but that was one in particular that hit a nerve for me where I was like, nope, I'm not going to bend the rules on this one.
Well, you did say early on that there are some things that, like the coming in on time, that are yeah, they're just you have to be defended. It looks like we're coming close to the end, so I want to make sure that people once again know if they want to learn more about your work. Of course, we've included those links within the chat. Grab those before we disappear. But if somebody wants to be in touch with you directly, I don't know if that's something you're open to. What's the best way of communicating with you?
My email is on the last slide that you'll receive, and my email address at UNICEF USA, that is probably the best way. There's also the LinkedIn option. I just don't always check my personal email as often as my work email. So I recommend my UNICEF USA email.
Right. And also the work that you're doing with APRA. Do you want to say a last thing about APRA at all before we rotate off?
Do definitely. Thank you for being such a good APRA ambassador from all of your past experience and your ongoing support of our professional association. So APRA is the premier professional association for prospect development, and that includes prospect research, relationship management, data science, as well as there's a lot of campaign and leadership work that we do in there. And we really consider ourselves the thought leader among philanthropy professionals on things like due diligence, DE&I, like the ethical collection, storage, and use of diversity data. And, things like data visualization, data science, like we're bringing that to the forefront. And anything related to the ethics of fundraising are areas that we feel that we really have tangible tools to provide. We're a member-based organization, so you can join. There's also a free listserv where you don't have to join. We just rolled out an associate membership level, so please come check us out. We have lots of toolkits. We have a newsletter that can help answer some of your most pressing fundraising needs.
And some of the stuff that you've been talking about today, you've been so generous to share through APRA as a channel. So APRA is a great way to keep abreast of these kinds of things. If you're not following every step you take at UNICEF, you can learn some of that through your work at APRA. So thank you for all of that. And thank you for the work you do with the community, Lindsey. We do appreciate you, as well as being willing to share all this today. I want to also thank everybody who hung out with us live, as well as those who are watching this in the future, and encourage you to go ahead and take a look at some of the things that we have coming up. As you probably know, we have about 120 programs this year, and that includes this next week. We have a session on reaching your revenue goal in 10 weeks or less. Yes, that is possible. Maybe not at UNICEF's budget size, but it is at a smaller organization, and you'll learn all about that on Wednesday. And then on Thursday, Many Roads, One Path. We have a conversation with the Senior Director of International Advancement at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, somebody I met back in Hong Kong in 2008 who's been running around the world. It is possible to raise money in the field these days throughout Asia. She'll be talking all about her experience with that. That's on Thursday. And we do have a podcast coming up as well with Lenny Meyer, who is the Senior VP and Chief Development Officer at Norton Healthcare, and this year's recipient of AFP's highest award, which is the Outstanding Fundraising Professional. So be on the lookout for that, and join us for any of these programs, which you can learn all about over at DonorSearch at donorsearch.net. Our thanks to them for that. And of course, our thanks once again for Lindsey for sharing today. We'll look forward to seeing you all sometime soon. Till then, take care.
Thanks, Jay.
Bye.